Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to make a fully lined bag with a hanging loop. This tutorial was originally recorded for my Intro to Family and Consumer Science class, but honestly, anyone with a sewing machine, some scrap fabric, and a dream can make this bag. So sit back, relax, and let's do this thing. The first thing you're going to need is a pattern for your bag. This is a pattern I made specifically for my class, but there is a lot of really fun patterns that you can get online. You're either going to need one pattern and then trace it, or print out two of the same kind of pattern. The choice is yours. Once you've printed out your pattern pieces, go ahead and cut those out and designate one of them as the back and lining pattern piece. Now, you'll notice that I only kept one of the little hanging loop patterns, and you may be wondering to yourself, what happened to the other hanging loop pattern? Well, my friends, we can't all live happily ever after. And that's enough of that. Our next step is to design our cool bag. Now, we are only going to be focusing on the front of the bag for this tutorial, but if you want to design the back too, you do you, boo. For this project, I went with a simple 3-panel design, and whoa, look at that transition. Not bad for being in my classroom with the phone in one hand and working on my project with the other. Now remember, when designing your project, straight lines are going to be way easier to sew than curved lines. But if you want to be fabulous, you go right on ahead. Now remember, once you've cut into your bag front pattern, you're going to need to add seam allowance to each of your new pieces. This seam allowance will allow our bag to get sewn together so that it remains the same size and shape as it was previously. If you don't quite understand seam allowance and how it works, that's okay. Just know that you need it, and if you don't have it, your bag is going to look pretty wonky. This bag is working with 1/2 inch seam allowance, which you can see from the little dotted line inside the solid perimeter of the bag. I went ahead and added in that 1/2 inch seam allowance to each of my new seams using yellow construction paper. Now comes the best part, picking out your fabric. Those of you who know me know that I love dinosaurs, so that's what I went with. When you go to put your paper pattern down on your fabric, do not put it in the center of your fabric. That just wastes a bunch of fabric. Don't be that guy. Nobody likes that guy. In fact, people dislike that guy almost as much as the guy who uses fabric scissors on paper. Instead, be the guy who puts the pattern piece as close to the edge and preferably in a corner as possible. This means we have more fabric for future projects, and we like that. Speaking of which, this is a great project for scrap fabric. So, if you or Nana or Great Aunt Jeannie have any bits and pieces laying around gathering dust, now you know what to do with them. And because of the type of project this is, we don't have to worry about things like making sure our pieces are on grain or cross grain. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. This is a beginner tutorial, and honestly, it's just a little too advanced for what I'm prepared to teach you today. Once you have all of your fabric pattern pieces cut out, it's nice to lay them out the way they're going to look in your final project. This is where you make sure everything looks like you want it to, that you've cut out all the pieces you need, and that they're all facing the right direction, and where you pick out any mistakes you may have made. For example, I'm just now noticing that one of my fabrics is not dinosaurs, it is dragons. It is fire-breathing, winged dragons flying in the sky. But you know what? I'm going to choose to believe that they are dinosaurs, fire-breathing, winged dinosaurs in the sky, and no one's going to prove differently. Take 2 adjoining pieces of fabric and place them right sides together. As you can see here, the right sides are the pretty sides, the sides that have the colorful pattern printed on them, the sides that you want other people to see in your finished product. Once you have the right sides together and they're lined up perfectly, go ahead and pin them in place. The pin should be going perpendicular to the seam, meaning at a cross, so that the ends are sticking out as shown. Now we sew down the seam with a straight stitch, making sure to back stitch at the beginning and ending of the seam and taking out pins as we go. Here we are ending that first seam. It is super important to remove those pins as you go. As someone who's had a needle come down on a pin and then explode in their face, it is not fun. Save your eyeballs, remove the pins. Once you have that first seam good and sewn, you're going to iron the seam allowances out and flat. Those of you who are not in my class, this is an optional step, but it makes your work look so nice and professional. Those of you in my class, this is your future. Get a good look. Now you'll work on attaching your next piece in the same way with right sides together. Please notice that the seam allowance has been pinned down. We want to pin down that seam allowance so that it doesn't come up and get stuck under our presser foot while we are sewing that seam. I did not show any part of sewing that second seam because, as you can imagine, it is very difficult to sew and hold a phone and record at the same time. So we skip that and go right along to ironing down that seam allowance. Again, we're ironing it flat from both sides, and it just looks so pretty. Moving on to the back pattern piece of our bag, and again, we are conserving as much fabric as possible by utilizing smart pattern placement. Feel free to use as many pins as you want going around the edge of this to hold it down, especially around that curve. Beginning sewers often find it difficult cutting around paper pattern pieces on the fabric, and if you can hold it down really well with those pins, it'll help you out a lot. Once again, we are placing right sides together before pinning the back of the fashion fabric of the bag to the front. That transition wasn't near as nice as the other one, but that's okay. We are all learning new skills here. Now, when you're pinning around, make sure that you pin all of the seam allowances down. We don't want them to get caught up under the presser foot of the machine. Ooh, and look at this beautiful half-inch seam allowance all the way around. Mwah! Chef's kiss. And we have a little bag. It's inside out and it's not quite done yet, but we have one. Now what we need to do is cut these pesky curves. Now we cut the curves so that the bag will lay nice and flat and neat. And I'll show you how to do that in 3, 2, 1. All right, judge me all you want. I give you full permission. This is why I teach sewing and not film editing. Speaking of sewing, you'll notice all those little triangle shapes cut out of that bottom curve. I like to call what's left there shark teeth. Now, repeat after me. 2 but not through. 2 but not through, meaning we cut to the seam line but not through it. If you cut through your thread, that means you have to go back and re-sew that part of the seam, and nobody wants to do that. 2 but not through, clip those curves. Now we can flip that sucker inside out, and we have a bag. It's a bag, folks, a beautiful bag. It's not finished, but it is pretty. Now you'll notice that the seam is a little weird, but that's nothing we can't get rid of with some ironing. Once you have the fashion fabric cut out and sewn together, you can work on the lining. I'm choosing this piece of muslin fabric that I used for an earlier project. You can see there's marker on one side, but not the other, so I can still use it. I'm folding it over like this and placing my pattern piece on top because I'm just going to cut 2 of the same piece of fabric. So if I can pin it all together and then cut it out all together, more power to me. Then I can pin the 2 pieces together, take it, sew it, and looky there. Now I tried to get this clip to go backwards so it would look like I was putting the fashion fabric bag into the lining bag. Obviously, that didn't work out. So do me a favor, use your imagination. Imagine that the fashion fabric bag went into the lining bag because that's what you're going to do. You're going to put the fashion fabric bag in the lining bag right sides together. So you'll notice that the fashion fabric bag is right side out, meaning that the pretty part is facing outward. The lining bag is still inside out, so when you put the fashion fabric bag into the lining bag, the right sides will be touching each other. I was also way too excited to film this part and the idea of having it run backwards that I did not clip the curve of my lining bag. And I didn't throughout this whole thing. Thankfully, it's the lining and it's on the inside, so if it doesn't lay quite right, no one's going to notice. But you will want to clip the curve of your lining bag, just like you did with the fashion fabric. You'll want to start pinning by lining up the side seams of your bag. So pin the side seam of the fashion fabric to the side seam of the lining. After you get those side seams pinned, you can pin the center of each of the sides of the bag and then all around the outside as much as you need. You'll want to mark a 1.5 inch gap in the seam around the opening of your bag. This is to give room to pull the bag right side out after you get through sewing the top. Sometimes when sewing cylindrical openings like these, it's really frustrating trying to get the fabric under the presser foot, but don't worry. A lot of sewing machines have a removable accessory case that you can just take off, and then you can slide that cylindrical opening right around what's left of the machine, and you are good to go. Woohoo! Our fashion fabric is now attached to the lining, and we still have that little gap. Now remember to backstitch on either side of your seam, that way it doesn't unravel, and then we can start the long and difficult process of pulling the bag right side out. I'm not gonna lie, I gave up on doing this one-handed. So here it is in pictures. Hooray, that was a workout. Now that we got everything right side out, it is time to shove the lining back in the bag. She is looking fabulous. Oh, so pretty. Ah, she's a bag. She's a bag. And now what are we going to do with this little gap that's left over? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Do you remember our little hanging loop pattern piece? Yes, this one whose brother unfortunately was lost to us. May he rest in peace. Well, it is this one that is still with us is time to shine. You're going to double up the fabric that you want to make your loop out of. Again, all we have to do is fold the same piece of fabric over and then pin through both sides, cut through both sides. You double up your fabric, you get double the amount of cuts. It's really simple and easy and saves you a lot of time. Once you cut those pieces out, you can pin them together. Once you have both sides sewn up, you're going to cut about half that seam allowance off. That way you can turn this thing. You're going to either do like me and use a pencil, or a better way is to take a safety pin, pin through one end, and then feed that up through the rest. Now, I'd like to lie to you and say this is a piece of cake, but that would only be true if that cake was made out of pure Tabasco sauce and frosted with broken glass. Still, you know what they say? What doesn't kill you only gives you some unhealthy coping mechanisms. Good luck. Once you've conquered the turning process, you can let out some of that built-up aggression by flattening it with an iron. Now fold your loop in half and stick the bottom ½ inch of the ends down into that gap. You're going to want to pin it in place really well and tightly, making sure that the tops of both the fashion fabric and the lining meet perfectly. This is important. We're going to use a slightly different stitch on this part than on the rest. First of all, if you have a sewing machine that does the different stitches, please set your machine to a zigzag stitch and then turn the stitch width to a 2. If your machine doesn't do this, that's okay. You can do a straight stitch and just put it a little further down on the bag, but when we're doing it with the zigzag stitch, we are going to line up the very edge of our fashion and lining fabrics with the middle of the presser foot. We are still going to backstitch, and we are still going to take out the pins as we go. Our eyeballs are still important. We still need to protect them. Boom, baby! She is here and she is done. Our bag is looking so good. She is ready to hold pens, pencils, hair ties, the broken dreams of your vanquished foes, and anything else that can fit inside and look great doing it. I am so glad that I was here to do this tutorial. I hope it has been fun and informative. I love teaching people how to sew, and I cannot wait to see what you do with your bags.